Welcome to Cranston Casting Company's video of the lost wax casting process. Cranston Casting Company has been manufacturing custom designs since 1948. This video will help you understand all the steps and labor that is involved in this ancient process. So sit back and enjoy as the process begins. The first part of the lost wax casting process is the vulcanized rubber mold. For this we would need a vulcanizer, mold frames, heavy screwdriver, good pair of scissors, tweezer, and an X-Acto knife. To determine the thickness of the rubber mold that you need, you want to make it 1/4 inch thicker than the model that you're using. You want to have a minimum of 1/8 of an inch of rubber on each the top and the bottom of the mold. When you're laying the plies together, you want to make sure you squeeze all the air out so the molds won't have any air pockets in it. Once the plies are all put together, then you want to trim it up so it fits very snug in your mold frames. It's recommended that you save the extra rubber so you can use it for packing in the molds as you're making them. Once you have the plies together, then you have to determine how many molds you're making and their size. Once the molds are laid out, you want to put your models into it. To prevent the models from moving, you just want to cut a little slot so they stay stationary. It's very important that you keep your hands nice and clean. The cleaner the mold is, the easier the mold will open up. This is called a powder separation mold. And now we're just cutting a little seat so we can put our nozzle. Alright, this is a little collar and it has a metal core in it. The reason why we put a metal core in this particular mold, if it's rubber and when you're pulling the wax, there's a good possibility that that rubber core will break off. So by using the steel rod, this mold will last forever. We'll get millions of copies from it. As you can see, we're cutting the shape of the bead. Just marking the square, cutting it half round so we can sit this model in and it'll stay stationary. Very simply, we're just pulling the rubber with the tweezer and we're cutting it with the X-Acto knife. Trying to cut it as close to the shape as the model as we can. Now we're just packing down all the open slots so none of the powder will get in and cause a tear. Placing the model back, cutting another support for the metal nozzle form we're going to put in there. And the last model is going to be just a typical stone ring. We're going to cut in the top of the ring. We're going to build up the outside and the inside so we can have a controlled seam and again a mold that will last forever. You try not to mark the mold with anything other than your tips of your tweezer. If you start using ink, it's going to make the mold very dirty, and once you make the mold dirty, it's not going to work out that good. You see we're pressing in the top. Now here's the rubber that we saved from the trimming. We're going to pack the inside and the outside stone of this ring. Pack it very tightly, try to get all the air out. And then we trim it nice, so it's nice and firm and the seam will be controlled along the edge of the ring. It is a tedious process, but the more time you spend on the mold, the better the wax will come out. Once all the models are laid into the frame on the rubber, then we have to put in supports. What we're doing here is we're putting in little rubber pieces, and these are going to be locators for the molds, so the molds stay together. And then this particular one, we're using square caps. The reason why we put the caps in is, again, to keep the mold stable. The reason why we put rubber underneath is so the locators won't squeeze all the way down. Now we're adding a little bit of black powder. That's called graphite powder. That's better than the white separating powder we use. So when we open the mold, the rubber won't tear inside these little whips that we're making. Then they're put back in the slots that we originally had, so they stay there. The middle mold has just little screw caps on it. You can also use them for stabilizers. Then lastly, we're going to cut a little piece of the Holland cloth that's on the rubber. That will help us to find a place to open the mold after it's vulcanized. Once it's all laid out, it's carried over to the mold frame. Put on separated powder. We prefer it in a little bag, but you can put it on with a brush. Blow off all the excess, then stick it into the frame. Again, be very careful. Make sure the models stay in the position that you want them. First, we're going to mark the tops of the mold in case we have to put any cut reliefs in. For instance, on the top of the ring and on the top of the bead. As you see, once we press down, there's an indication mark on the rubber. We're putting the black graphite powder on the top half of the whips. We cut out reliefs for the top of the ring and the bead, and now we're powdering it up. Adding our nozzle forms, putting the top on, closing up the frame, and then we'll put it into the vulcanizer. The rule of thumb for vulcanizing is 1 hour per inch thickness of the rubber mold. It's suggested to go to your rubber supplier to find out the temperature of the rubber. Most is about 325 degrees. As we crank the frame up, and we let it sit in there. Once the mold is done, we take the mold frame out of the vulcanizer, open it with a screwdriver. As you can see, it leaks out a little bit on the edges. We pull it out, trim it all up, take the frame apart. It's easier to take it apart when it's hot. Let it get cold, it really sticks together. Trim the mold up. The reason why you trim it is so when you put it into a clamp or on plates, you'll get equal pressure on the mold. You want to make sure it's nice and flat. Once you have it trimmed out, you look for that little corner. You see it opens up, and it just opens up very, very nicely, as you can see. And voila, we're going to end up with 3 perfect molds. You want to take the models out if you can when they're hot. Once the mold cools down, it'll be cut apart, gated and vented for the waxes. As you can see, we're cutting up the lines that we made, very simple. Cut the bottom side first, cut the middle mold out. Then you want to place that middle mold on the top side so you'll have perfect molds that fit together perfectly. Once you do that, you want to connect the nozzle ends to the piece. Cut the rubber away first, we do, and then we burn it, just to kind of make it a nice, smooth channel. The smoother the flow, the better the wax. If you do burn it, you just kind of wipe it off with a cloth. You burn one side, you can just touch it up on the other side so you know exactly where it goes. Make a little vent so the air can go out but the wax won't flow through. Then you want to cut any reliefs of any undercuts. So again, the wax will form incompletely. Mark the mold to identify the customer's name and the style number. The second part of the lost wax casting process is the making of the wax. What we do here is we just put separating powder inside the rubber mold. We would put it in between two metal plates and into a clamp. The reason why we do this is so we get uniform waxes every time. Now we would put the rubber mold up to the nozzle of the wax melting pot. What happens here is air forces the melted wax into the empty cavity of the rubber mold. Once the wax hardens, you would remove it from the rubber mold. Being very careful in bending the mold several ways to relieve the wax and keeping its form and shape. Once the wax is removed, the rubber mold can be repowdered and another wax can be made. In this production mold, you can see that the three waxes come out perfect. The mold is bent several ways so the wax comes out and keeps its shape. After the wax is made, we recommend that it's inspected by another person before it is set up. The reason for this is there's still a lot of phases left and we want to make sure if the wax is no good, there's no way the casting can come out good. So we clean the waxes, clean all the vents out, double check to make sure they're good before they go set up on a tree. Once the waxes are proven to be good, then with their wax fused onto a wax rod, this is called the wax tree. You want to get as many pieces on as you can as the same casting temperature without them touching each other. Once all the trees are formed, they are fused onto rubber bases. If your pieces are too big for a tree, they would go directly onto the rubber bases. Here's just an example of all the different pieces that we make here at Cranston Casting. After all the waxes are put on the rubber bases and determine the weight and metal of each mold, we would then put a steel flask around the waxes. Once we put the steel flask around the waxes, we seal the bottom so the investment won't leak out. Then we would mix water and the investment powder together. Make sure you put the water in first. Once the investment is added, you want to mix it by hand a little for about maybe a minute. Then once it's mixed by hand, then you want to put it on a machine mixer so it's very, very smooth. If there's any lumps in it, they'll fall and they'll break all the waxes. The machine is going for about maybe 3 minutes you mix it for. Once the investment comes off the mixing machine, it goes into a vacuum. What this does is it removes all the air from in the investment so there won't be all bubbles all over the castings. The investment is poured very gently over all the wax patterns. Once they're filled up, they would be re-vacuumed in case any air was driven in by the pour. After the second vacuum, the molds will be capped off and then they'd be set over on a bench so they can harden. You don't want the molds to sit more than 1 minute before they start hardening. The next step in the lost wax process would be the burnout of the wax from the flask. What we're doing here is we're taking the flask cylinder full of investment in the wax and we're putting them into burnout ovens. Now this determines by the size of the mold and the size of the oven. Here at Cranston Casting, we do a 14-hour burnout at night. Starts out very slow, peaks at about 1500 degrees. What this does here is it burns and melts out all the wax, hence the lost wax casting process. As you can see here, this is the beginning of the burnout where the wax is ignited and melting out of the molds. And then as it goes on in the cycle, you'll see that there'll be no more flame, just red flash. To To determine if you had a good burnout in the morning, you want to turn your molds over. They got to be pure white. If there's any black in them, you have to reburn them. The next step would be the actual metal casting, the melting of the metal in either pouring or centrifugally casting it into the metal molds. There are many ways to do this. At Cranston Casting, we use induction furnaces. It could be done by a torch, could be done by electric melter. The hot molds are taken out of the oven, and as you can see, they're nice and white, and all the wax is burnt out. This is a centrifugal casting machine. What happens here, the metal is melted in the induction furnaces, placed into holders in the centrifugal casting machine. It's turned on, and as you can see, the whip will force the metal right into the empty cavities of the investment flask. The other method would be called vacuum assist. This is where the metal is melted, brought over to a table where the vacuum is going to help the metal flow into the empty cavity of the flask. Right now they're cleaning the slag metal off the crucible so none of the dirt would go into the flask. And a steady pour into the flask. Again, this is called vacuum assist. The next step after the metal has been casted into the investment molds is to break out the investment. Once the metal has solidified, the hot flasks are grabbed with metal tongs and quenched into cold water. The cold water turns the investment into a slurry. Sometimes a couple of taps with a hammer helps it out a little bit. Once the metal castings are removed from the flask, they are brought over. The remaining investment is washed away with water pressure. After all the investment is removed, they're put into an ultrasonic cleaner or a pickle to turn them white. Finally, we'll have the raw metal castings. After they go through the cleaners, the castings are just cut off the trees, separated, and built. Right now we just have raw castings. They do have to go through finishing processes, which is either polishing, plating, oxidizing. This concludes our video. If there's any questions, please contact Cranston Casting Company. We'll be glad to help you in any way we can. And we hope you enjoyed and learned the lost wax casting process.